Good afternoon, and this is the final session of a conference which I've been in parts of and I found really rewarding, very, very interesting. And I suppose it's quite apt. This final session is about evaluation, because you always do evaluation at the end, don't you? So we've chosen to do that then. And I've also just realised I've just left my bit of paper on the table, so bear with me for a while.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. That's extremely professional of me. Right, so yes, we're looking this afternoon at evaluating participatory practice, and this is something which in my workplace at the moment we're very much grappling with, looking at new matrices for measuring social impact, the impact of particularly around our youth participation project, the impact it's having on young people, and trying to come up with new ways of evaluating. So I'm particularly interested in what our three speakers have to say today. Before I left the office this morning, I did say to my colleagues, I said about, well, why do we evaluate? And after someone had said, because you tell us to, which is true, and pointing out, of course, from generous funding we received from Heritage Lottery Fund, thank you very much, that we need to satisfy our stakeholders, of course, and funders, which is very important, but also to look at the impact, more importantly, the impact on our participants. So how it can add value, to our own practice, to the practice, in many cases here, of artists, as I said before, for the impact for funders, and I say most importantly for the participants. So it is very important that we look at these areas and we go beyond the box ticking. So we go beyond sort of the top-down instrumentalism, which probably most of us are very familiar with and probably within our comfort zone, into more work around action research, and about the process, evaluating the process as we go along. So these are three presentations today which are going to start to flesh that out. So how we're going to do this is each participant has been asked to speak for 10 minutes. We'll then take some questions, brief questions, which we'll have here on the panel, and then throw it open to you. This session is looking at innovative methodologies for evaluating participatory practice. And some of certainly while I've been here, two of the projects and programmes that have been evaluated have been referred to, Tate Circuit programme and also the Generation programme, which ran last year. It was a fantastic programme across Scotland. But also looking at the Collective Gallery's all-sided games. And it comes from different perspectives, from a freelance research perspective, from an academic perspective, and very much also from a practitioner. So we have three ideal speakers for that. I did try to get out of them the tell us something really interesting about you that nobody else knows. Only one of them played ball. So one of the people here on the panel did once take a bottle of Thunderbird wine to Jonathan Dimbleby's party. I'm not going to tell you who it is, you're going to have to work that out, and I'll tell you at the end. So, whoever's the guilty-looking one there. I was also going to make up a couple of really juicy examples for the others, but decided not to. So, anyway, before this gets out of hand, our first speaker asking today is Ros Hall, who's a freelance researcher and a critical friend for the Circuit programme. So she's been very much involved in engaged art practice since 1991 and draws on that wealth of experience that she's going to talk about today. Ros.
Thanks. I've decided to stand at the lectern just because everyone else has, and I don't want to feel that different.
Please do.
Thanks. But I'm actually not going to show lots of slides or anything. I'm just going to talk, really. As Stephen just said, I've been involved in socially engaged arts practice since about 1990, 1991. And the reason why it's maintained my interest and the reason why I've carried on being involved in it is because of the difference that I witnessed it making for everyone involved. That really intrigued me from the outset, from my very first experiences of facilitating such work. But also, I suppose, because of the difference I know that it made to me in my life in terms of my own personal experiences. My specific interest in evaluation actually grew from two concurrent observations that I made during the action research that I planned and conducted for PhD. And the first of those observations was that the young people that were engaging me and engaging with me as part of my action research process were making images using photography and digital media in the old indoor markets at the Bullring in Birmingham, not the new Bullring markets, the old Bullring markets as they used to be, which was a really specific space. What was interesting to me in terms of what led me to be really slightly obsessed with evaluation was that in that space where I was working with them, those young people were really informing my own evaluative understanding and interpretation of the images that they made. The images that they made were powerfully resonant. They often made me cry in night. But that was because my understanding was very much informed through the meaningful dialogue that I'd had with them around their image production. That dialogue wasn't forced or planned or in any way predetermined. It happened as they were making, and they shared things with me that they chose to share with me, which usually illuminated the meanings that were embedded in the work that they were making. Young people led the dialogue, and I think that was partly reliant upon the fact that I'd situated myself quite strategically in a space where the usual power relations of adult to young person were significantly and usefully exploded. The dialogue didn't, and I'd suggest it couldn't have, taken place in response to any questions or prompts that I might have had. They would have laughed me out of the place. It was an organic exchange, which they developed and shared with me, and through it they gave me glimpses into their everyday experiences and insights into what the creative processes they were engaged in meant for them, often in terms of how they used it to make sense of their own lives, their own often very complicated lives, and the issues that they encountered and the conflicts that they were seeking to resolve within those busy, complicated young lives. The second observation that was key to me becoming really interested in evaluation was the processes that I witnessed at that time, and this was from 1997 to 2000, quite a while ago now, that were being used in both formal education and what was then called community arts, as well as a range of other more formal arts contexts, seemed to be severely lacking. They were lacking in most qualitative, in lots of ways. They were lacking in there being any qualitative or meaningful sense-making of what had happened or what might be learnt from it. I witnessed some organisations getting repeat funding for projects that had engaged a high number of people without there being ever any attempt to get any sort of feedback from those people about the quality or meaning of the experience they'd had, and whether it had made any difference for anyone or anything. And what I began to recognise through those two observations, I think, was the really key thing about evaluation in terms of its connection with power and control. What's been interesting, I might struggle a little bit because, as you'll see, I've been reflecting on my notes over the last day, and I've added quite a lot to them, so I might get a little bit lost in points because I've added. And one of the things I wanted to mention was that during yesterday's presentations, there were many points that really chimed in significant ways with my own thinking and with what I wanted to talk about today. And one of those was a quote from Barbie Asante when she talked about, or asked, she quoted a question which was about who determines who is, objectively speaking, exceptional and talented enough to be admitted into HE Art Ed. Barbie later directed me to the website she was quoting from, which I read with great interest last night, and which articulates how less transparent yardsticks really do inhibit a quest for diversity, because notions of who has potential and what potential looks like tend to be inherently classed and racialised. And I think that for me, that really helped me to articulate why it is that evaluation is really important for me, because it's pivotal. It has a pivotal role. And for me, it's really important, therefore, that criteria for success are determined through dialogue with everyone involved. They're not established independently or outside of that exchange. I've got the name of the website if anyone wants to know that later. So also, as a photographer and therefore as a creative practitioner myself, I was really aware of how when you're engaged in any creative process, we reflect in an ongoing way to make decisions about what to do next. And that's what those young people were doing when they were talking to me about their work. But I was also aware, as an action researcher at the time, of the similar function of a reflective process within the action research cycle. So I began to consider at that point how an action research approach to evaluation, but also using evaluation as part of an evaluation, as a part of the action research approach, might be a more meaningful way of thinking about planning and conducting evaluation than any of the models I could witness taking place around me at that time. And I began to think about how, when you're using such an approach, you can ensure a greater equality of input into the evaluation processes, because those might be developed through the exchange rather than them being sort of more formal or rigid prescribed processes. So within such a process, I was imagining that everyone would be seen as an expert rather than someone being seen as the expert or the evaluator. Everyone's an evaluator, everyone's an expert. So the other thing that's key to that then is that if you see evaluation in that way as part of an action research approach to your work, then it's key that the evaluation happens not at the end, but throughout something and is embedded within the thing itself. So it's really important, therefore, to establish appropriate mechanisms for generating that sort of exchange and stimulating reflection for everyone involved. Because by doing that, you can ensure an equality of input. So what's crucial then, I think, is to ensure that the mechanisms by which people can engage in evaluative exchange aren't exclusive. So in other words, they don't simply invite responses from those who feel most confident about talking or writing, and they don't simply invite responses from people who already have the confidence to believe that they have something worth contributing. So by embedding them within the activities themselves, by them being seamless, it means that everyone contributes in a way that doesn't rely on them thinking that they have something worth saying, which I think is really important. So creative evaluation activities, I think, are best devised from within a project in response to the specific contexts and actors within that project or organisation, because those enable people to think through as well as to contribute their opinions. And I also think that it needs to happen in a way that's, once we're immersed in the work and can identify what's going to work in any specific context. It's no good, I don't think, to just be armed with loads of techniques and to go in and apply them. It's far better to work with people to find out what criteria they have and what solutions they might have to enable a meaningful evaluation process to take place. So in Circuit, which as Stephen said I'm a critical friend for, part of my role was about supporting young people across the country to evaluate the Circuit programme for themselves. And all I've got up here is the Circuit website, because what I'd really like people to do, rather than me going to different pages on it now, is invite people really to visit the Circuit website after the conference, because I think you'll find it really useful. There's a really rich, I think, set of contributions on here by the Circuit young evaluators who are called Circulate. So the Circulate group have been working with me, and what's really interesting is that the Circulate group come from all the different galleries that Mark mentioned. So all of those galleries, very different cohort. A lot of the galleries, people engage in different ways. Some are more sustained, some are less sustained. So what's really important is that those young people devise evaluation activities that are relevant to their own context. And so, for example, one of the young people at First Sight has come up with this idea, and there are so many examples on the website, but I think just to give you an idea of the breadth of them, one of the young people at First Sight has come up with the idea that what's really important is to ask the audience what questions they would like the people that have organised an event or a festival to consider as a really radical democratic way of evaluating something, I think. One of the other things that I think is really important, it's again cropped up and been reiterated for me throughout the exchange yesterday, is really about how important it is to think about what Mark said earlier, what our motivation is in terms of why we're involved in the work that we're involved in and what is the ultimate aim. So for me, one thing that's really important is that everyone is involved in evaluation, not just the people who we are seeking to engage, if you like, but all of the people who are doing the engaging as well, and the organisations. That evaluation is really important that everyone's involved, not just participants, for want of a better word. And one of the things that Darren mentioned in his keynote speech yesterday was about evaluation having to be about the difference in experience makes for everyone, including the artist, the facilitator, the organisation. And one of the key things about a circuit, I think, is that one of the aims is for organisational change to take place. So one of the young people at Manchester, Charlotte, is actually seeking to do a piece of evaluation work using the sort of Gillian Waring approach, where she's working with people that work at the organisation for them to, and she's using photography, she's photographing them and asking them to summarise in a few words what they think the difference has been to the organisation that Circuit has made. So she's evaluating organisational change. One of the other things that's been enabled by this approach is for young people to critique the actual programme itself, or some of the ideas that sit underneath the programme, if you like. And Stephen, who's actually here today, over there, from Collective Liverpool, has written a paper that's called The Trouble with Youth Voice, which I think a lot of you would be really interested in, and it's downloadable from here. So there's been a range of different approaches. Young people are developing more creative ways of evaluating things and articulating their findings and their learning. It's informing the programme as it goes, and also young people are disseminating and articulating their findings through things like the paper that Stephen's written and presented at a BERA conference earlier in the year. I've run out of time. I have more to say. I'll try and squeeze in the other things in answered questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Ros. One point I'd particularly interested now is about how the challenges that there are in terms of organisational change that evaluation can throw up. Our next speaker is Julie Crawshaw, who is based in the north east of England, but also part-time at the University of Gothenburg. She's a researcher and also an academic. She is, by trade, if it is indeed a trade, is a planner cum anthropologist. And in taking a very innovative approach, she has developed an auto-ethnographic, which is easy for me to say, approach to evaluation that she undertook around the All-Sided Games project, working with the Collective Gallery in Edinburgh. Julie. Okay.
Thanks very much. So first, I'd just really like to thank the organisers for inviting me. It's very nice to be here and to be part of this conversation. So, yes, as Stephen says, I'm a researcher. I work between urban and rural planning, art and anthropology. And based on the sort of core disciplines of my sort of PhD, I call myself a planner anthropologist with quite an experimental research practice. My research is informed by learning with, not just about art. I'm concerned with art's capacity for revealing and writing ways to evoke the art experience for further engagement by the reader. Today I'm going to talk about evaluating the experience of All-Sided Games, or ASG, as I'll refer to it, a programme of what might sort of usually be described as socially engaged works commissioned by Collective during 2012 to 14. So the evaluation was commissioned as being experimental and to inform future programming and to explore ways to more fully describe what the commissioned programme does or the work does. So at the outset, I would say, of course, that I must acknowledge that experience is a complex and unstable concept. Our expressions or what we say about it are not the experience itself. So where to go from here? As an evaluator, my approach was to take part as a participant myself and experiment with autoethnographic writing to account for my own experience, and from this position interview others about theirs. And from here describe the relationships of the work, not as set apart from our day-to-day, but acknowledge that our experience of these commissions flow in and out of daily life. The approach is premised on describing rather than explaining what takes place. Rather than being methodologically complex, I utilize storytelling as an approach, as a way to engage the reader in what happens for themselves. It was a modest commission of around 25 days, and this short paper that I'll give previews the story, and I urge you, as Ros has done, to please visit the Collective website for programme information and a copy of the full sort of narrative, which will be arriving at some point soon. So, as most will know, Edinburgh Collective is a contemporary visual arts organisation delivering exhibitions and projects. All-sided games placed artists is listed here to work with people in and around Commonwealth Games venues. The ambition of the programme was one of creating circumstances of mutuality, how to evaluate making mutuality. The language of audit fuels cultural debate. On meeting ASG steering group members, however, I met support for an exploratory study, urged to do something more than measuring, to take time to notice, engage with the slipperiness of knowledge. And I should say that these images that I'm showing are mine, so they're sort of part of my fieldwork diary. Chalk lines on grass. On a bright spring morning, I take the train from Newcastle to Edinburgh. I turn left down a main shopping street to make my way to Holyrood Park. After 15 minutes, I can see where I am to go, but can't work out how to get there. I ask a builder at work on the roadside. He points towards a small passageway leaving the main road, and I nip through. I'm welcomed by a bright blue sky. Walking towards a glass and concrete building, I can just make out the white lines of a running track on grass. I pass cameras and other equipment sprawled around a small tent. I'm here for 0 to 100, an artwork commissioned by Collective from Christina Lucas. 1 to 100 is a 100-metre run for 100 people aged between 0 to 100. Collective staff and I had discussed my role as a participant observer. Today I was to be a steward. Later myself and others are asked if we would run. I hadn't thought about being a runner. Yes, of course, I'll run. There was a pregnant woman at 0. Number 1 was a pram of triplets and parents. The oldest runners were in their 80s. Due to some no-shows and wanting to keep people as close to their age as possible, numbers were shuffled. I was 43 at the time and given 48. We line up. I look down to the lower numbers to see the starter man. He had his official Commonwealth Games outfit on. Bang, running. A feeling of feet on soft wetness, slippy, right hand forward, left, trying to pull my body with my arms, my face opening and smiling, starting to laugh, feeling open, really enjoying it, seeing others in front of me and smiling. I'm not very fast. My experience of bodily connection is difficult to describe. When I interview my fellow runners, they also find it difficult to put into words. When I ask a man a few lanes up from me to tell me about his run, after a long intake of breath, he says, "Yes, that is a hard question to answer, but I will try." Once the pistol went off, his initial feeling was, "Oh no, I'm going to be left at the end." At this point, he says, a feeling of competition kicks in. You can't deny your animal instinct. The notion that we are going to be first, he suggests, is built into us. Christina Lucas's concept was one of a race with ourselves, not against each other. I go on to attend Play Summit by Nils Norman, a 3-day programme of walks, seminars and play activity exploring the nature of play. The Queen's Baton celebrations at Meadowbank Sports Centre, including the presentation of dialectograms by Mitch Miller. Highly detailed drawings of the Piers Hill Community Flat and Meadowbank Sports Centre. and No Conflict, No Irony, I Love the Whole World by Jakob Dahlgren, a film charting the design and making of a 100-metre banner in collaboration with families across Edinburgh, then Walk to Salisbury Crags. Bright House by Florrie James, a film set in 2044, exploring ideas about regeneration in the East End of Glasgow, and A Leisure Complex by Dennis McNulty, a promenade performance event in Carnoustie Leisure Centre, which in his words, gnawed at the audience's sense of spatio-temporal certainty. In writing, I take influence from pragmatism as understanding the world as in the making. From this interactive position, there is not a knower outside of the world to be known, but a knowing experience that takes place in the relational fabric of being in the world. We know as we go, as we journey through. The slipperiness of knowledge. ASG takes place as associations between buildings, landscapes, and people. Rather than understanding ethnography as a way of representing ASG, I follow the view of ethnography as a way to evoke in the reader responses that cannot be commensurate with the writers. To evaluate ASG, I ran with this. I set out to evoke responses. By amassing descriptions of being in the programme alongside the stories of others, I set out to fabricate new openings for discussion. At the interim report meeting, sharing episodes of my own experience and other participants' anonymous accounts was much more intimate than what might be expected of an evaluation process. It feels like a mirror, someone said. After lining up to run, my co-runners recall people stretching and doing lunges. To support my consideration mutuality, I explored anthropologists' consideration of ethnographic fieldwork. Lisette Josephide suggests that ethnographers are transformed by the fieldwork experience and end up in a different place from where they started. They stretch themselves to meet others in a new place through an imperiling of the self. Each person taking part in ASG, collective staff, artists, sports facility users, runners, walkers, are stretched by doing so. We are shifted. I feel this during the programme. Taussig calls the imperiling of self somersaulting. I suggest ASG has produced collective somersaults. As a participant taking part in ASG stretched me to notice. The work softened my hold to make room for understanding the complexity of the way we are interconnected. I notice how I am being. I learnt this with this work. The works utilise different strategies for interweaving our collective nature. They include physicality, acts of making, sensory engagement, and fiction. What unites them is experimentation. Those taking part are privy to the parameters of the operation as a walk, run, making banners, but what will actually happen cannot be described in advance. They are acts of finding out. By stepping out of the usual way of doing things, Collective made room for much needed exploration of what happens in practice. They made the opportunity. So what? As an academic planner, what value is produced? And how might we transvalue or reappraise the accepted standards, understandings of value? How can we plan for the future? Recently, in a thrilling and succinct presentation, I was clearly reminded by James Holston that beyond consultation, we are looking for new forms of deliberation. In working towards circumstances for mutuality, I suggest these works and others like them are deliberative. As multisensory, they are more than we can say. I urge for interest in ways to evoke the value of deliberative work, as produced by artists and arts and other urban rural practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. I particularly enjoyed the very visceral nature of the evaluation there. Thank you. Our final speaker is Victoria Hollows, who's museum manager of the Gallery of Modern Art, a couple of hundred metres away, for Glasgow Museums and Glasgow Life. And we've already heard, certainly while sessions happening at from Peer Arts Centre and Robin from National Gallery of Scotland, a little bit about the Generation Project, 25 years of contemporary art in Scotland, and Victoria's going to talk about the social accounting process that she's developed and was developed to evaluate the programme for young people. Victoria.
Thanks, Stephen. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me today. I'm representing Generation and the number of practitioners who are working with the public engagement programme. This afternoon, I've just got some slides that are just going to rotate around. I'm not necessarily speaking to them, but what I'm going to do is just remind everybody what Generation was about, what we endeavoured to do with the public engagement programme, and specifically the co-production element of that, which we then evaluated using social accounting process. And the findings from that are due to be published very soon, so this is a sort of work in progress. So Generation, as some of you may have heard throughout other presentations the last couple of days, was a major nationwide exhibition celebrating the best and most significant art to have emerged from Scotland in the last 25 years. And because that was tied to the Commonwealth Games and the cultural programme in 2014, that was 1989 to 2014. Featured over 60 venues, participating across Scotland, and over 100 artists. And you can find more information at generationartscotland.org. It was a partnership created by core partners Glasgow Life, the National Galleries of Scotland, and funders Creative Scotland. And from those core partners, we had representatives who established a public engagement group to really look at that aspect of Generation delivery. So it wasn't just about the very beautiful and amazing work that we were able to see in the gallery spaces. It was also about that sometimes more intangible, more invisible engagement with public visitors and what that actually meant. And the aims for that was really for the sector to work more closely together across the country, to deepen the public's engagement with contemporary visual art, to increase the number and the range of people taking part, and to have a particular focus on developing experiences for young people aged 12 to 25 years. So the public engagement team developed an overall framework which had 3 strands. One was a kind of foundation strand to encourage people to push their practice during this opportunity with a bit of extra help from Creative Scotland funding, particularly for young people. We're also supporting development of community practice clusters or geographical practice clusters to help people engage working with each other, to share resources, ideas, thinking, peer learning, and also to support a specific co-production programme to work more deeply with young people, to perhaps try and find some exemplar projects or to test and experiment in ways that we hadn't been able to do before, but working with colleagues across the country, see what those comparative experiences were. There were a number of subgroups to the public engagement team as well, looking at creative careers and how we can influence the curriculum. Those are ongoing, and I think you may have heard from some colleagues as part of the Fringe yesterday. So there was an underlying ethos to invest in the sector, to develop learning and development opportunities within existing staff, not just to bring people in for a particular programme, but actually to really build on the very significant practice we do have here in Scotland, and to value and recognise the level of skills and expertise that we have. The projects and the programmes that were established for the co-production element received their funding by producing proposals with the following criteria: that they would work with co-production methodology, that they would work with people 12 to 25 years, but particularly those who don't normally participate or engage in the visual arts sector, so not ongoing engagement with young people or groups that they were already participating with, or who have perhaps an opportunity to self-lead their engagement with contemporary visual art, but people who weren't. And to work in partnership in the arts sector, but very specifically with agencies out with the arts sector to support young people or organisations working and supporting young people, so non-arts sector partners. And co-production in this programme was defined as providing opportunities for young people, in this case aged 12 to 25, and working with them to direct their own learning and to design and shape opportunities of interest and relevance to them. The organisations working on the projects were National Galleries of Scotland, you heard from Robin just before the break, in 3 different locations, Glasgow Life through Tramway and Gallery of Modern Art, Platform, Glasgow East Arts Company, Collective in Edinburgh, and Dundee with DCA and McManus. A range of other partners were involved, And the organisations formed a co-production cluster to support their peer learning, reflection and how they develop their projects and programmes as a community of interest for themselves. So why social accounting? Well, much of the discussion early in generation planning was around how we perceive the role of the visual arts sector and how that's perceived outside the visual arts sector and what that role might be. And we wanted to really drill down into what practitioners, I think, feel and know the impact and the value that their work has, but sometimes we find it very, very difficult to articulate what that is. Or that we do hear about projects who say, this has been transformational, life-changing, and maybe that absolutely is the case, but how do we understand and value that? And also, how do we make the case for this not being a one-off project, but some ongoing commitment to this as a process of a way of working? So we also wanted to recognise that we do evaluate on a regular basis, but what do we actually do with that information? How are we working with it? How are we learning from it? And how do we continue to improve our programmes as a result? So we actively chose not to bring in an external evaluator because, again, we wanted to reinforce that investment in the sector to have a bit more confidence with the information, the data that we're collecting. We wanted to have the potential to understand the impact on people and on organisations in more depth by consulting with a range of stakeholders, and that was very, very important to the process. It was particularly important as we were working with a range of non-arts partners and our experience or lack of working with them and trying to develop that understanding. And therefore it was very experimental. We hadn't an awareness that anybody in the visual arts sector was really working with social accounting. It's something that's often used in the third sector. But I do feel that we're in a climate and a moment and a sort of process where we're really needing to think beyond the kind of, we spent this much money and we got this many people through the door. What does that actually mean? You know, what's our impact? Yes, economically, but what's our impact on people and organisations? How does that help us change? And what's our impact on the environment? That's something we didn't really tackle, but social accounting can look at that. So after reviewing some models to measure social impact, we chose social accounting as we felt it provided a really strong framework to capture evidence that was well suited to the programme. I have to say that because we were working as a group of organisations for a particular programme, it was a little bit atypical for social accounting. Usually it is a single organisation working on that. They usually follow the financial year time frame. But what we did do was use quantitative and qualitative data. We did the consultation with key stakeholders. That was very critical. And we gather evidence basically throughout the process. So it's not at the end, it's ongoing. And if you want to think about it in terms of your financial accounting, you would be keeping your receipts through the year and all your financial data, you would get that audited at the end of the year so you could prove what you were doing with your money. It's that sort of system. If you imagine if you have an organisation with a financial director, how might that change a little bit if you also had to be responsible to a social accountant? So we're gathering evidence throughout the process, and I have to say a big thanks to my colleague Iona McCann, who worked with me on this process, because she acted as the social accountant for the Generation programme, and we wouldn't have got this far without her. But also a critical factor with the social accounting, it's audited by an external panel, so it isn't just what Iona and I and the rest of the co-production cluster felt we'd achieved. We actually had to be able to prove and track that evidence down to its root source. So there was a panel day where we had 3 colleagues, volunteers, working with us who are experts in their sector. Sarah Yearsley from Engage, Dermot McAuliffe from University of the West of Scotland, and Ron Cowie from Education Scotland. We were lacking somebody from youth work sector, which we had tried to do, but we haven't been able to achieve. Who spent a day with us assessing all the data that we'd looked at and asking, right, you're saying this, where's the evidence to support that, and looking to track back so that we can't claim anything without actually saying this is where that came from. So what we did through the process was to set 2 objectives for that co-production programme. One was about the young people and one was about the organisation. Young people, we were looking to work with co-production methodology to generate positive experience and impacts for young people in terms of their confidence, their skills and their relationships by hopefully providing the following expected outcomes, and that helped drive the activity that we worked on to produce this. Increased confidence, new skills, beneficial relationships and positive progression. So actually key life skills, not necessarily about creating artists of the future or other creative activities, although a lot of them were very passionate about that. And for the arts sector to use co-production methodology, encouraging organisations to expand their practice to engage with a broader range of young people and partners by providing the following outcomes for project staff, and that's organisational staff, artists, interns: enhanced connectivity, effective communication, increased learning and knowledge, and impact in future work. We have also had to set our values right at the beginning, and that was done through a collective facilitated process, and the ones that we agreed on were empowerment for young people, transparency and a culture of sharing, reflection in all our work, and working for a future impact. So I think the rigour in the evidence was the critical difference for us in terms of supporting those outcomes and what we believe are the longer term impacts. The full report is going to be republished shortly, and we can send out the link to that when that's ready. And we're currently working through the summary accounts, which is proving a little bit more challenging because the full report's 98 pages long, and we need to get that down to something a bit more digestible without losing the essence of it. But we do believe the outcomes are transformative and indicative of the potential to positively impact young people at a critical life stage in ways that benefit society through increased citizenship, contribution, and reduced cost to the national purse. We believe that Generation's co-production programme offers an excellent, effective and replicable model to work with young people through contemporary art to develop their confidence, their skills, relationships, and explore issues that are important and affecting them, for example, employability, mental health, self-image, as we heard earlier. And a principal recommendation is to support the dissemination of findings out with the visual arts sector. And also we would like to see a national funding programme to support young people facing inequality of opportunities to offer pathways to positive life choices and self-directed learning through contemporary art and creativity. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. I think what we've heard there is very much about applying a very rigorous methodology and the collation of evidence. And really it's about accountability for both in terms of co-production, both for the young people themselves, but also for the organisation. I will open up to questions in a moment, but I'm just going to ask my colleagues one question to start them off. And it's really around what do we mean by impact, because that's a continuum from the I had a nice day to I had a nice time to it changed my life. But what in terms of the evaluation studies, what do they feel they mean by impact? And actually I wrote something down from when I left the office before, which was we did a fantastic project, youth engagement, and one of the bits of evidence we collected was the young person said, I like this because he could do as much as he wanted or as little as he wanted. So I'm still trying to work that one out actually. So I'll start from the end. Ros, what do you mean by impact?
I don't use the word impact. I really struggle with the word impact, and for a couple of years now I've been thinking, what is it I don't like? And anyone involved in the circuit programme will tell you that I say, can we talk about the difference that is being made by the programme and through the programme rather than talk about the impact the programme has? And I've struggled to work out exactly what it is I don't like about it. I've known that it's something about the fact that it sounds a bit violent, so that automatically makes me think, feel uncomfortable. But it's also about there's an implication that someone is being done to. There's an implication that the impact is being had on the person engaging. And I think that when we talked about earlier, someone talked really articulately about learning being about people with different experiences, different understandings coming together and sharing that. And I think that co-production, collaborative ways of working are the thing that's actually at the heart of the work that we do, and the thing that does actually mean that what we do makes a difference for everyone involved. What's really interesting is that it's not the first time this has happened in my life, but it happens quite frequently, is that I've been thinking about this and trying to articulate what it is I don't like about the word impact for a couple of years. And Francois Matrasso has now said it in a nutshell for me. And it's a paper that is called Music and Social Change, Intentions and Outcomes, that he gave at a symposium in Belgium recently, in October. And he talks, and then this is a quote from it, the problem is that impact suggests something forcefully striking an object, like a die impressing itself on a blank. It implies an active agent and a passive recipient, a subject and an object. One might even think that it unconsciously reflects the gendered imagination that divides the world into active male and passive female. And like that imagination, the metaphor is freighted with potential violence. In this thinking, the social art project is conceived as an experience whose impact changes those who take part. So I think it's really useful. This whole paper is really quite useful, because I think the other thing that Mark made me think about earlier when he talked about what our motivation is, the work that we do. I've been thinking quite a lot about that this weekend, and lots of things have led me to reflect on that. And sorry if I'm going on a bit. Try and squeeze in the things I left off the end of my presentation. The thing that Alicia said yesterday when she quoted Stuart Hall really made me think quite clearly as well about how he talked about the I think that the thing for me is that the motivation for me ultimately isn't about diversifying or increasing audience numbers. Ultimately, for the sake of it, ultimately for me, its motivation is about enriching cultural experiences of everyone by ensuring that a diverse set of cultural experiences and understanding inform galleries, so that galleries become more reflective of a greater diversity of those experiences, and that they value and validate them in ways that lead everyone to feel that all unfamiliar cultural expressions are of equal value to those that they're familiar with. Because I think that's key to the thing that Stuart Hall said that Alicia quoted, which I can't find on my piece of paper now. But ultimately, it's about ensuring people have equal fulfillment of their cultural entitlement. I think everyone's entitled to be able to engage meaningfully in a cultural exchange, and for as long as it's the case that some people don't have access to that, then there's an issue around equality that needs to be addressed. So for me, it's about making sure there's inequality in terms of who it is that gets to have meaningful cultural participation and who doesn't. Thank you.
Judy?
I don't use impact either. So without kind of perhaps, because I certainly would like the way that Ros has talked about that. So I'll think of something else, I think, around impact and why. So I strive to use more experiential language. And in part I do that because I think when we talk about impact, we're usually thinking about impact in relation to a certain outcome, which has been preset. So we're looking at something predefined, we're literally looking for it. So what happens to those occurrences? How can we see what we're not looking for? The stuff that's outside of that lens.
Okay, thank you. Victoria?
Well, clearly we have been using the word impact. But it's similarly in the social accounting, it was about looking for the difference that we've made. So I think it is around change. And when we've been really scrutinising the data and the writing of the final reports and the summary reports, I've had exactly the same question as Ros at the end there, thinking, that sounds a really violent term, impact, and, what do we do about that? But it is kind of in the language and the currency that we use at the moment. So I haven't an answer for an alternative right now, but I think it's having that self-awareness. And I think I don't believe that we can be part of this kind of work. It's not change on other people. Nobody can be involved and not be changed themselves as well. And I think the evidence that we were starting to see was that organisations were changing too. So people have talked earlier about that organisational change and development. You can't be impervious to that. So it's something that impacts on everybody. I've said it again. So.
No, I'd agree. I mean, that's partly, I think, because we bid into funds that are seeking certain changes in, behaviours or attitudes or what people do. So there's a preset impact there. There's actually sometimes the most meaningful impact, again, using that word, never use it again, is around the change within the organisation that then happens rather than the circus moves on and we just do the next thing. Right. There's an opportunity, we've got 10 minutes or so for either points or questions. If you could raise your hand, indicate yourself. Roving mic will find itself to you. If you identify who you are, where you're from, if that's relevant. or keep it anonymous? I'm just going to carry on talking until someone puts their hand up, really.
Everyone's tired.
Anybody? Right. Okay, well, I will continue asking questions then while you think on. Which is, in each of the 3 studies as well, what would you have done differently now that you've done it? Because so all 3 of you took very different approaches, and predetermination wasn't maybe set from the outset. That's true. So yeah, what would you have done differently? Victoria?
I think one of the things that we said straight off the bat, and it was challenging for a number of reasons. It was the timescales that we're working to, and the range of organisations we're working with, and everybody's project was setting off at a different time, was exactly what Circuit's managing to do, is to have young people evaluate the programme themselves. So that's a really obvious one. I think the very nature of the way that we've used this process, you're just constantly thinking now, it's designed to make you think what you would do differently moving on. So it would be a little bit difficult to kind of think I would go back and do the same project again but differently, but it's actually about what I would like to move forward and what the sort of the energy of that group working would like to move forward with. And the whole point of that process is that it's a kind of ongoing iterative process year on year, and I can't tell you the quality of that experience, particularly with the audit panel and the depth of thinking that day and the exchange with partners and stakeholders within that sort of process in terms of feeding the thinking, the debate, the reflection, and shaping and changing work that will come in the future. So I think it's just a kind of forward movement, even though that doesn't quite answer your question, but it's definitely a forward movement, and obviously we are going to be 110% more experienced in the whole process of social counselling, which is a complete new way of working for us.
Thank you. Julie?
I think perhaps I should, because I'm not sure if I explained this, but my invitation was, I guess, as a commission really, as part of the programme. So it was about being kind of experiment. I was commissioned as evaluator, but as part of the All-Sided Games programme, to do something sort of in tandem. And as I explained, I did it in the way that I did, and during the programme there were meetings with Collective to discuss the sort of material that was arising, so my own ethnographic sort of diary, and also the sort of interviews, experiential interviews, kind of with others. And I think if I was to do this again, I would have a much bigger conversation about discussing the sort of possible, discussing the process, I think, much more so, even though, and discussing some of the sort of, just some of the tensions around power relationships and so on, which actually came up really nicely in the last panel, but really perhaps sort of preview some of that more, I think, between those involved in the process.
Thank you. Ross?
I think that perhaps, it's interesting because Circuit's still ongoing, so in a way what we do is changing on the basis of what we recognise these would be an improvement as we go along. But I think that if I was to go back to the beginning, I probably would start a bit differently, and I think initially for me there was an emphasis on bringing together all of the young people nationally to form this group called Circulate, and I think I perhaps would have spent more time instead going to individual galleries and supporting young and getting to know the difference between the contexts a bit more, and having more one-to-one or small group dialogue with members of the different groups across all of those galleries. And I think that for me would be driven by the fact that what I think is really important about evaluation is that it's part of that cultural entitlement in a way. And I suppose what I've learned as an adult is that when middle class people go and see a film, they talk about it with each other afterwards. And I've, as well as learning not to take Thunderbird to posh dinner parties.
There you go, revealed.
But yeah, so, and I think that basically that's part of our cultural entitlement, is to make sure that people have that opportunity to reflect on the experience. And for lots of young people, there isn't necessarily that opportunity to reflect in that way by discussing their experience with other people around them. So for me, it's key that that happens, and I think that maybe I would have started that, making sure that that was happening earlier on in the programme.
Anyone like to ask a question or make a point? So, we'll be down here, so just hang on.
Thanks very much. I'm just troubling about this thing about impact because and I know you're not saying art doesn't have an effect, but sort of coming from that point that you just made about somehow it's about people being able to talk about the effect that something had on them. So in a way, yes, I can see how evaluative practices maybe should steer clear of the word impact, but we have to talk to people who've undergone arts experiences about what it did to them, because I think there is disagreements about whether art transforms people, and some people think it does and some people think it doesn't, and I feel I see quite a lot of transformation taking place, a lot of people be deeply affected by things, and sometimes in trying to measure that it doesn't hear their voices. So I've been really interested to hear about these kind of very creative practices for recording the voices of people, discussing their experience. So just kind of entering into the discussion.
Thank you. Any comments back on that?
I suppose that, I mean, for me, I think that, yeah, what's interesting, I think, is that it's only certain people who we ask what difference has been made for them. There's an assumption that we need to measure that for some groups of society and not for others. And I think that for me is where the discomfort lies, really, is that it's assumed that it's a beneficial experience, which is why people do it. Whatever sort of cultural experience it is that people do it because it's beneficial. And I suppose that, yeah, for me, that's where the discomfort lies, is that it's only certain people that sort of have to prove the difference that it makes, and other people don't.
Do you measure people hating things, or does it come up in the evaluation that you do?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Anybody else? No? Well, we are then just out of time. So I'd like to thank our participants today, and of course yourselves. So if you'd like to join in a round of applause. Thank you. And I found that a tremendously useful session myself, just in terms of how we're rethinking how we do evaluate, and indeed not use the I word. So thank you. I'm going to hand back now to Jane, who's going to make a few closing remarks. Thank you.
Sorry, I think we might be a little out of order. Annabelle and I just wanted to say a very quick thank you to all our fantastic speakers, but also thank you to the audience, to everyone participating in the conference and the conversations that have gone on. It's been a really fantastic experience for us.
Yeah, and particularly to all the breakout sessions this morning. I know some of you have not had the opportunity to be up here at the top, and all the young people who I just saw doing lots of breakout sessions this morning, who were incredible, really incredible, and I wish I had had that poise and confidence when I was their age, so thank you to them.
To do a final thank you to really all the speakers, chairs, delegates, for all of you for taking part in what I found incredibly stimulating 2.5 days. It's been absolutely brilliant sharing that experience with you. I'm going to say the thing that I always say at this point, which is you have an evaluation form. So please fill it in, or you can do it online if you like. But we really take your feedback incredibly seriously, and it will impact, it always does, on next year's conference, which actually leads me on to next year's conference. So we're having conversations with colleagues in Liverpool at the moment about conference in 2016, being in Liverpool at the time of the Biennale. But there'll be more information about that soon. So I'm just going to finally hand over to one of Engage's wonderful board members, Susan Lonsdale, who's going to say a few words.
Thanks very much. There've been a lot of thank yous to a lot of people, to all of you, to the fringe organisers, to the speakers. But there's one group of people, I think, who haven't been thanked, and that's Engage itself and the staff of Engage. Ever since I've been a trustee, I've been astonished at the range of work that the Engage staff take part in, and the amount of hard work that they do. And I think they've all been a very quiet and busy working group in the background. So I would like to say thanks very much to Engage staff, the Engage volunteers, and not least of all to Jane Sillis. I think without them, this wouldn't have happened and it wouldn't have been such a success. So if you can just join me in thanking them.